Brazil is big. Really big. Like, over 200 million people live in Brazil. That's 2.5% of every human alive. And while 2.5% doesn't sound like a lot, that 2.5% is responsible for an eighth of the world's fresh water, a third of the world's soybeans, and a quarter of all World Cup championship teams. 2.5% can do a lot.
So, when 2.5% of Brazil came out on a single day to protest, that was a lot of people out protesting.
Yeah. So, in the last 4 years, Brazil has been in a near continual state of protest. Yet, somehow, each movement continued to strongly mobilize across the country. Well, 2.5% was only reached on one occasion. Reduced numbers of 1% of the total population were still very frequent in Brazilian protest. For some context here, the largest protest in U.S. history, the Women's March that happened after Donald Trump's inauguration, reached about 1.5% of the U.S. population. And Brazil continually topped that number over the last 4 years. So, why were these protests so big? That's what we really want to know.
So, let's look at what made so many people mobilize. Protesters were motivated by the issues, and we'll go into that. But beyond the desire for change, what tactics actually enabled such a large protester turnout? So, I got a chance to talk with Margaret Grease.
Okay, my name is Margaret Grease. I'm senior lecturer at the University of Washington in Tacoma. And altogether, I've lived about 13 years in Brazil. I also take students yearly to Brazil as a study abroad program.
I also got a chance to talk with Jeff Seward.
I'm a professor of political science at Pacific University in the Department of Politics and Government. I have a PhD from Stanford in political science, and my dissertation work there included 3 years of field work in Brazil in the mid-'80s. And I just, this last month, published a book with Routledge Press on Brazilian political economy.
I'm Ian Hoyt.
And I'm Ezra Rich, and let's take a look.
Okay, let's go. Let's start with 2013, when the protests first started getting big.
At long last in Brazil, 3 consecutive administrations of a progressive left-wing party in power that in the end wound up disappointing its progressive followers because they never really attacked sort of fundamental issues of inequality in Brazil, and they really didn't do a particularly good job of improving public services that poor people and middle-class people in Brazil rely upon. And the precipitating events for these ones back in 2013, were increases in bus fares.
Okay, so I'm going to paint you a picture here. So you live in Sao Paulo, along with 12 million other Brazilians. Each day you pay the metro fare and you go to work. This fare costs you about $1.38 a day. Then, in June of 2013, you arrive at the metro station and find your fare now costs $1.47 a day. This is what started the largest nationwide protest in Brazil since the end of the dictatorship in 1985.
Wait, what? 9 extra cents in metro fare?
Yeah, because 3 months of nationwide protest with over 2 million people taking part.
But there must have been other reasons.
Yeah, so the metro fare was in many ways the straw that broke the camel's back.
Well, for one thing, economic growth slowed down. The first 2 administrations of the left-wing party, the PT, the Workers' Party under Lula, benefited from kind of a global boom in exporting commodities. All of Latin America kind of benefited from a big export boom connected to China and China's rapid economic growth. But that slowed down in the last few years, and so the third PT administration was presiding over much slower growth, and so they were less able to fund social programs and the like, and fund things that would expand the middle class. So there was sort of a natural grumpiness associated with just the slowing of economic growth, I think.
But at the same time, it's pretty incredible the amount of support that mobilized to protest a 9-cent metro hike. That's the interesting part. It takes a certain amount of tactical brilliance to turn like a 9-cent jump in ticket prices into 9 weeks of nationwide protest. So let's look at how they did it. In March of 2013, a couple of months after the rising fees were announced, the protests started simply as boycotts, with several thousand people in urban centers taking part. Most of them were young, middle-class students. And they began to, boycott the metro system as a tried-and-true tactic of protesting the fares. To protest that the metro fare had gone up, the protests wouldn't ride the metro. This seems pretty by the numbers at this point. Not seeing any results by mid-May, however, the protests looked for further, more visible tactics. That's when the first marching demonstration started. So, here's where the first important mobilization factor comes in. While the demonstrations were in protest of the government-run transportation authority, the protests were not political. The organizers had no party affiliation, and nor were there any marches branded as such.
Why wouldn't they want political affiliation? If they appealed to a certain political party, couldn't they get a strong group of supporters?
Yeah, that's exactly what I first thought too, but the exact opposite seemed to be true. By not hitching themselves to any political party, they could appeal to anyone and not alienate certain groups in their potential protest base. Don't drive away half of all metro users if you can't help it. So, over the course of early June, these protests grew in size, attracting people from everywhere on the political spectrum. No one likes it when you have to pay the government more money. And while the original goals were very specific and low-key to reduce or at the very least freeze public transit costs, as growing numbers of Brazilians joined the protests, the scopes, they gradually increased. Not only did people make signs protesting public transit costs, but also education spending and government corruption and healthcare. While the organizers continued to send a coherent message to the government, they allowed their marches to be an outlet for numerous other causes that fell under the umbrella of, we think the government is screwing us.
These were organized almost against the political parties, and what was interesting is then left political party people, elected officials and so forth, ran down to try and get associated with this and grab leadership of it, and basically they were repelled. People said, "We don't want you. We don't want any politicians here." And there were far right groups as well as far left groups, and then sort of less partisan, non-political middle class groups, but they were all sort of united around, we don't want this movement being captured by politicians. And so they were very hostile to politicians who showed up trying to join up.
Interesting. So they fed off several other movements and used them to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people?
Yeah, exactly. The organizers found a balance to keep the official messaging specific, but using more general concerns to fill the street with passionate protesters. They made the salad bigger by adding more leafy greens. But one of the problems is when you get passionate people involved is that they don't always behave themselves.
Behave themselves?
Yeah, they start clashing with police, and pretty soon your peaceful salad of protesters gets some tear gas dressing. The way the organizers responded next, however, is the most impressive part. They told all the protesters to bring rags soaked with vinegar to help neutralize the burning sensation of tear gas in their eyes. And they went through like a total rebrand. Their protest became V for Vinegar.
Like the movie?
I think it was a graphic novel originally, but yeah. The genius of the V for Vinegar name was that it was a catchy, cool name that the Brazilian media could run with. Not only did news outlets repeat the name over and over again because it was just awesome sounding, but the media ran with the narrative implied by the name. Like a small group of dedicated patriots working to expose and destroy the corrupt heart of their government. That's when the protests really got big.
TV Global, which is the major media giant in Brazil, has a very, very high audience. They have their telenovelas, which almost everybody watches. They have the national television news that almost everybody watches that every night. I mean, it's really quite amazing, the monopoly that they have on news. Of course, you can get news in other ways online, but David Global is, for the most part, conservative and supports the elites.
On the other hand, Globo is not at all sympathetic to the PT governments. And so to the extent that these demonstrations felt like they were directed against the PT and directed against the PT government, I would think that Globo would have tended to be sympathetic. This is just guesses, but I would guess that Globo tended to seek out people in the demonstrations who would articulate anti-PT, anti-government rhetoric.
Leaf or Vinegar dominated the news cycles, and it became a cool and trendy thing to be a part of. On June 17th, over 250,000 people across the country came out to protest. The combination of casting a wide recruitment net and spinning the movement as like a cool and edgy thing in the Brazilian media brought mass demonstrations across the country in June. During the summer of 2013, with protests entering their third month and the total number of participants passing over 2 million, the government came to the bargaining table. So, in late June, the Brazilian government mandated a nationwide reduction in public transit fees. The protest organizers had won. But for some reason, it didn't stop there.
No?
Yeah, so when your primary mobilization tactic is to cobble together a bunch of people dissatisfied with the government, regardless of their motivation, and young people who find the protest edgy and a trendy hobby, the protests don't just stop when metro fares are reduced. The protests continued through June and July, maintaining a strong mobilization the whole way. And their weight of numbers forced through reform after reform after reform.
They ended up with a very broad range of demands about all of these kinds of investments in public services and public facilities that weren't being done.
The criminalization of embezzlement passed. The reappropriation of oil revenues for education passed. The moratorium on homosexual conversion therapy passed. Anti-inflation legislation passed. Until the end of July, the mass demonstrations resulted in very tangible changes in public policy, due almost entirely to the capacity of organizers to mobilize the masses.
And if only that were the end.
Spontaneous demonstrations broke out originally just around the bus fare issue, but then more and more groups and more just random citizens across various classes started protesting about a whole bunch of other things. And then they got linked up to the soccer tournaments in 2013 and then the World Cup, and complaints about how many billions of dollars the government was pouring into new soccer stadiums and other facilities for the World Cup that were unlikely to bring much economic benefit to the country, while at the same time public services, schools, infrastructure, healthcare, and the like were continuing to be neglected.
So again, you live in Sao Paulo. You don't have the best education. You work a relatively low-wage job. You would probably be considered lower class. You've just succeeded in relowering the bus fare and passing several new reforms. However, you notice on your way to work that there is a massive structure being built in the middle of the city. A stadium.
Some of the stadiums were made, with marble pillars. They were quite extravagant. And so there was concern that there was money going towards the building of these stadiums and not towards other things such as health and education and social welfare.
Hold on, but don't Brazilians like love soccer?
Brazilians are crazy about soccer. I mean, literally just way over the top about soccer. But these expenditures on big fancy stadiums and things, especially in areas that there was never going to be any use for these things after the World Cup was over or the Olympics were over, really made people angry when public health facilities and so forth were dilapidated and underfunded, and schools were inadequate, and streets and roads weren't being kept up. It just felt like, well, you're spending a lot of money on spectacle and a lot of corruption involved in the contracts going to people to build all this stuff while you're neglecting fundamental needs of the population.
This is what caused the first protest in Belo Horizonte, where the Confederations Cup game between Brazil and Uruguay was happening. This then caused a wave of protests across Brazil against the World Cup and the government corruption.
It was not a movement. It was a spontaneous protest. And there's a difference between protesting and a movement. I have been aware of groups that have been working together with residents and with the universities and with journalists that have tried to pressure governments, have sought out information. I think it was more these more focalized groups rather than, a national campaign.
But in a certain sense, there's an imitation effect. Oh, gee, did you hear there was a big demonstration in Sao Paulo yesterday? We should be doing that today. Here, a little bit like all of these protests that are happening right now in the United States at these town hall meetings that Republican congressmen are calling. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's some organizations behind all of this, but it's not exactly a nationally coordinated thing. It's like people see it on TV and say, oh, we should do that with our congressman. And is he having a town hall? If he's not, let's go protest that he's not having one. And if he is, let's all go show up. And then indivisible groups and other groups, union groups, teachers groups, and so forth, all show up. But it's not exactly a nationally coordinated thing. And yet the various events are feeding off each other and feeding off media coverage of each other.
Brazil is a very large country, and it's separated by the Amazon rainforest, and due to the fact that the World Cup was in so many different cities across Brazil, how is the word really spread across the country?
Well, I think basically these days, two things. One, I think a lot of these demonstrations were not especially coordinated. That is, the same kinds of issues cropped up in cities across Brazil. I mean, Brazil is a country of 200 million people, and it's got 15 or 20 cities that are, 3-4 million people or more. And they were sort of putting one of these big expensive stadiums in every one of those cities. And so local people would get upset, and then there'd be local issues that people would be protesting about. But of course, these days it's a lot easier for protest movements like this that spring up in several places to coordinate their activity through the internet. And then in particular locales, social media was important for saying, oh, hey, let's have a demonstration here. We're all going to meet there. And, people would communicate through Facebook and Twitter, and one thing that observers noticed was everybody at these demonstrations had a cell phone. One of the articles I sent you mentioned that this sort of misled people into thinking, oh, well, this is basically middle-class revolt, because look, everybody's got a cell phone. But it turns out even people who live in Brazilian slums, 40-50% of the residents have cell phones. So you couldn't really tell the class character of a particular protester by whether or not they had a cell phone.
Have you heard of WhatsApp?
The
app WhatsApp?
Yeah, I have.
Brazilians use social media. I think probably more than Americans do. And so word does get around. That's not difficult to do. People use WhatsApp a lot. That's probably going to be the second question they ask you once you get off the airport, if you have a WhatsApp account. And that goes across the board, poor people have their phones and they use them also. So,
as the Confederation Cup ended, the protest continued up until about May of 2014, when the last major protest really happened, even though the World Cup was coming up in just 2 months.
Yeah, well, for the World Cup, they had this one just mass protest, and it was primarily, millions of people were out in the streets in several cities, and people that you would never think would go protesting. I mean, grandmothers and families, and so it was people from the middle class on down. Say, the middle class was also very much disgusted with the way money was being spent, and so there was a broad range of people that were protesting the World Cup. It was kind of a spontaneous, almost celebratory feeling right before the World Cup.
But as the World Cup started, the Brazilians' love of soccer overtook their need to protest. The protests fizzled out, and nothing really happened. Nothing was achieved.
And over time, once the World Cup actually got going, the protests pretty much settled down, and Brazilians settled into watching the Cup. And then the Brazilians got to the semifinals, and they were favored to win, and they got humiliated by Germany 7-1, and that sort of created sort of a national depression. It's hard to exaggerate how much emotional investment Brazilians have in their national soccer team. And I think that actually helped sort of mute further protests. It was like people were too busy mourning the soccer team's humiliation to get really riled up about going back in the streets. But they broke out again in the months leading up to the Olympics around similar issues of you're spending all this money on this while you're neglecting public services.
When the Olympics started, and the preparation for the Olympics started a few years later, the World Cup protests, the same exact kind of protest, started again. Large city-organized protests that fizzled out as the Olympics started, and nothing was really achieved.
But once the World Cup started and once the Olympics started, there really wasn't much disruption of either one, and the protests tended to be much more muted during the actual games than they had been in the run-up. And then once the games had passed, I think that there was a sense that, well, there's not much point now in protesting what has already been spent on the games because we can't stop that, and we're not. And so after the event, the protests sort of naturally kind of dwindled down until the next eruption over new issues.
And after that, Brazil returned to calm and quiet.
JK, Brazil was about to experience the largest mass demonstrations in the history of the Western Hemisphere.
The World Cup protests came out against conflicting interests and big government corruption. What could possibly be more inflammatory than that?
Even more government corruption, i.e. the largest bribery and embezzlement scandal Brazil has ever seen. Let's take a look.
I did take a group immediately after the World Cup. We talked with people that were in poor communities, and we talked with academics And it is a complicated situation where they were really questioning the corruption and the lack of transparency and human rights.
And after the Olympics in 2016, then there began to be, after the election, there were protests against the president. But that was over other issues. That wasn't over the World Cup or the Olympics. That was over the Petrobras scandal.
So it all centers around the company Petrobras. Petrobras is a Brazilian oil company. It's majority owned and majority controlled by the Brazilian government. It's one of the largest companies in the world with over $100 billion in revenues annually. So in 2014, the Brazil Supreme Court began what it affectionately called Operation Car Wash. This was an investigation of government corruption and bribery centering around embezzlement from Petrobras. Over the next year, what began as some overinflated government contracts and a few misplaced checks began to look more like a government embezzlement conspiracy. So, while the investigation began and pretty limited, in March of 2015, the Supreme Court released a list of about 50 names of government officials who were now under investigation. Most of them were from the Workers' Party. That was the ruling party at the time. And many were current or former associates of President Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil at that time. While Rousseff herself had not been directly implicated by any of the evidence to that point, the rising discontentment of the Brazilian middle class erupted with the catalyst of Operation Car Wash. There was blood in the water. That March, 27 different party members were convicted of corruption charges, setting off a string of nationwide protests. With each name released, another wave of mass demonstrations would sweep the country. While it's hard to get an accurate tally of the number of protesters, the government and pro-government sources underreport the number of protesters, while organizers and pro-organizer media overreport. Everyone agrees that Brazil came out in force. So here's some notable dates. So on March 15th, 2015, somewhere between 2.4 and 3 million protesters came out across the country. On April 12th, 2015, that was somewhere between 800,000 and 1.7 million. On August 16th, somewhere between 900,000 and 2 million protesters. While these are the largest individual days, every major city in Brazil had some sort of continual protest action through the entirety of 2015, demanding greater government transparency, accountability, and in some more radical cases, the impeachments and resignations of key figures. Then, in March of 2016, Dilma Rousseff was thrown out of the frying pan and into the fire. Her predecessor and political mentor, Lula da Silva, had his house raided by police. The investigation uncovered evidence that Lula was not only directly implicated in the Petrobras scandal, but was also guilty of bribing representatives to vote his way during his time as president.
Lula was very popular personally, but the PT never had more than 20 or 25% of the Congress. And so they had to stitch together coalitions with other parties. And the first big corruption scandal that broke out PT was that they basically put several hundred members of Congress on a payroll and were paying them every month, giving them a regular cash payment every month to support the government. And this was being run by the president's chief of staff. I mean, it would be like Reince Priebus paying off members of the Congress to support Trump's political agendas.
Oh shit.
Yeah. Let's just say that March of 2016 saw a tad bit of disruption. Here's some numbers. So, on March 11th, 2016, there were somewhere between 1.4 and 2.2 million protesters. On March 18th, 2016, somewhere between 400,000 and 1.5 million protesters. And on March 13th, 2016, there was anywhere between 3.6 and 6.9 million protesters.
Wow. I guess that really makes sense. Learning how corrupt the government is really would make people angry. Is there anything really that special about people being angry?
there's a bit more to it than that. So take a look at this picture and describe it for the listeners.
So it's in a city area. There are buildings in the background, and the photo basically depicts what I'm going to assume is some sort of road. You can't see the road. It is covered in what looks like somewhere in between, like just in the picture, a few thousand and maybe like a few 100,000 protesters, mostly wearing yellow and green, and then a bit of white scattered throughout their colors. Everybody's holding up signs. There's a big Brazil flag that a bunch of different people are holding, and it's just like, it is massive. Like, there are so many people in such a small area.
Yeah. So that you're right. So the big things you see, like the first thing that jumps out is this huge Brazilian flag and how everyone's wearing yellow and green. So the protests of 2016 were built on nationalism. The actions of the government made many Brazilians lose faith in their government, and rightly so. I mean, the middle and upper class voters felt like they didn't have a voice, while the poor voters felt betrayed by those who promised to fight for them. Protesting the government soon became the only act that a Brazilian could take pride in. By standing up to their leaders, they could stand up for their nation. This nationalism not only brought even greater turnout from wealthier demographics, but pulled in those who traditionally supported the Workers' Party. And as those who were not protesting saw how those protesting could once again feel proud in themselves and their country, millions of protesters joined in. So people would wear Brazilian football jerseys, they would paint their faces, they would wave flags, they would celebrate the country that they loved because they felt that the government wasn't doing it for them. That picture that you just described, that was taken on the protest that happened on the 30th anniversary of Brazil's return to democracy. March 2016 was the perfect breeding ground for for a mass mobilization, because nationalism was rife in the air with a dissatisfied populace and the anniversary of democracy that, ironically, was even more lacking. And that's what brought almost 7 million people out to protest. While never did the protests reach the scale of the ones in March in 2016, demonstrations continued against the Brazilian government, calling for the impeachment of Rousseff. In July, she had a 7.7% approval rating. In August, she stepped down. The protesters seem to have been successful with their short-term goal.
Well, the most recent polls showed that the number of people thinking that the current government was good or excellent were like 10%, which is where the government that was impeached was before it got impeached. And it's been trying to implement fairly unpopular programs of austerity and budget cutting and things like that. So I think there are likely to be protests continuing against that kind of sort of neoliberal austerity.
Billions of dollars had been siphoned off to politicians, and those that supported Dilma said that the reason she was impeached was to protect those who had been involved in corruption scandals. So now people are protesting because this corruption, despite Dilma having been impeached, they are still able to continue with the processes against certain politicians.
But my sense is that in the long run, fairly amorphous mass social movements like this tend to, unless they can somehow create more substantial, more permanent organizational forms of some kind. And I think you see that in this country. I mean, what's left of the Occupy movement? Very little, and that's because it seems to me they were actually sort of philosophically opposed to creating strong organizational forms. They haven't really been organized by particular parties either. You have the PT, and now the PT president has been impeached and removed, and her vice president was put in power, and he's from the largest party in Brazil, the PMDB party. But that party is notoriously corrupt, and he's already had to dismiss 5 or 6 of his cabinet ministers because they were accused of major corruption scandals. He announced the other day, in fact, that he wasn't going to dismiss ministers anymore if they were only accused of corruption. They'd have to actually be indicted before he got rid of them, or otherwise he'd have to be purging ministers every other week.
Suffice to say, there's a long road ahead for Brazil.
So, what tactics were most important for mobilization? That's the topic here. That's what we're trying to pin down.
Okay, yeah. So starting with the V for Vinegar protests in 2013, one thing that I noticed was that they got big because they didn't try to alienate people who could join them. They wanted to be as inclusive as possible and attract as many different people as they could to their protests. Like, that's why the no party affiliation thing was big, because it didn't alienate other people from joining the protests and allowed more people to come out.
Did different parties try to support the protest and the protesters rejected them, or was it just that parties didn't want to?
The protest became slightly more politically charged sort of at the end, once they gained more media traction. But at the beginning, like when they were first starting out, they purposely were not affiliated, because when you're starting out small, you need every person you can get. Like, they needed to get the snowball rolling down the hill in order to get big. And so they needed to be inclusive at the start.
And the interesting thing is that was the same for the World Cup, protests. They very much rejected any political affiliation, and so throughout the protests, there really wasn't a national leader for the protests, and in the end, that was its downfall, because as the World Cup started, people were would rather watch the World Cup, and they were enjoying watching the World Cup, and so they didn't feel the need to protest, and there wasn't really a leader to unite them during the World Cup and have them continue to protest.
Yeah, that's one of the things that seems pretty consistent, is that it's easy to mobilize people for a short amount of time, to say, okay, we're all gonna meet on this one day, or we're gonna spend in this month there's gonna be a bunch of big protests. But and all the protests we looked at, there were peaks in the protest season, the March of 2015 and 2016, they were huge peaks in the anti-corruption protests. And while people still did protest, during other times of the year, you don't see nearly as many people. And so when you're trying to mobilize, you can only expect it to happen during a small time scale, we're going to meet on a specific day or during a specific week. Trying to organize lots of people over a long period of time is really hard.
Yeah, and that was sort of the same for the World Cup protests. The Confederation Cups, during the time of the Confederation Cup, so more or less the year before the World Cup, there were a lot of protests against the building of the stadiums, and against the games, and that was really the big time for the protest, and a large part of that was because one city would see another city protesting and would be like, hey, we should do that. But there wasn't really a leader saying, okay, on this day everybody's going to protest. It was more a thing of, oh, we should maybe we should protest too. I don't know. And so it was very much city based of, oh yeah, our city doesn't want that. Not really our nation doesn't want that. And so it was each city didn't want it, but not the nation as a whole. Yeah.
That's an interesting thing. I also noticed that a lot of the protests against the government were city based, and I think it's just because it's easier to organize people in a single city than it is to organize people across the country.
Yeah. But even for the more recent corruption protests, there have been the anti-current government, so the governments that are I guess not the Workers' Party have been supporting the protests and sort of making sure that it's happening in big numbers, and they get benefit from it. Whereas I feel like with the World Cup and the bus cost protest, they weren't really supported by a political party, and I'm curious to see if the bus protest had gone on longer, and if the government had kept not doing something, if the people would have continued to protest, or if it would have sort of ended due to the lack of leadership.
Yeah. So I think the reason why the public transit protests were successful is actually much of the same reason why the anti-government protests have been successful. It's because the way that the branding of the protests has made people feel empowered, made people feel good about themselves. Like the V for Vinegar campaign, it made people feel like they were rebels, that they were doing something that was cool, like they felt that they had power, that they had influence, and the media was paying attention to them. And so that made protesters feel empowered. It made protesters feel like they were part of something that was big and important and that was going to be successful. Just like the nationalism in the anti-corruption protests made Brazilians feel like they mattered, and that they were part of something bigger, and that they had the power to affect things, and that they could, instead of feeling bad about their country, feel proud of their country when they were protesting.
That was what really lacked in the World Cup protest, which is probably one of the reasons they didn't necessarily fail. They were very strong, but there wasn't really a goal associated. The goal was sort of, hey, you shouldn't do that, sort of, but there wasn't a unifying V for Vinegar. That was a unifying, maybe not cry, but thing. And there wasn't there were certain calls, but there wasn't really a unifying, very nationalistic-esque piece that really made them feel stronger and better in the World Cup protests.
Yeah, that unity piece really is interesting and makes a lot of sense. If you need everyone to come together to protest, you need a strong base of unity. So, looking to take away lessons from this, it's clear from the early stages of the V for Vinegar protests that, and also from the World Cup protests, that you want to be inclusive when you start out. You don't want to shove people away. You want to welcome as many people as you can to your cause.
And then you also want to make sure that for people to mobilize, that they have something to mobilize around. They have a big... they have a goal. So for the V for Vinegar protest, it was the V for Vinegar, that's what it was. And then for the corruption protest, it was really nationalism and Brazil as a whole. Remember the description of that picture where you very much have a lot of green and yellow, and then you have this giant Brazil flag that it's like those flags that you see on sports fields, those big flags that sort of represented, we are Brazil, and this is what we want.
And to always try to focus your mobilization around short periods of time, and try to unify people as a specific way as possible, because it's hard to keep large numbers of people engaged for a long period of time. So, if you are ever interested in staging a mass uprising in Brazil, or really any other country for that matter, we hope that our discussion was helpful, and that you can help apply the lessons that Brazil has learned into mobilizing your own mass demonstrations.
Thank you to Margaret Grease, and thank you to Jeff Seward for joining us and being willing to talk with us. It was really interesting talking to them and learning their opinions on these issues that they have studied very much in depth.
And thank you to Dave Whitson for helping us organize this project.
And with Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, were the social media sites that Americans tend to use? Were they very prevalent, or were they very much not used?
Everybody was using Orkut, which was actually a Turkish site. And then from one day to the next, everybody turned to Facebook. And that's been quite a while. I would say maybe 7 years or so that people have been using Facebook.